Hi there, and welcome to this session as part of the Cloud Lunch and Learn Marathon. You're joining me as we go ahead and talk about requirements, design patterns, cloud architecture, oh my. My name is Chris Reddington, and I am a cloud solution architect at Microsoft. And one of the things that I do in my spare time is I go ahead and I do blogging, I do vlogging, and I do podcasting. And the topic that I talk about is Azure. And some of my particular interest areas include things like cloud solution architecture, DevOps, and the app development space, really. So if you're interested in any of those topics, please go ahead and like my channel, Cloud with Chris. I am on YouTube, and I'm also on Twitter at RedO'Bowen. And of course, if you're not on YouTube, that's absolutely fine. My podcast is also on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and cloudwithchris.com as well. Now, in this session, we're really going to be covering cloud solution architecture, if you hadn't guessed already. Now, we're only going to be covering the tip of the iceberg, though, because we have only a limited amount of time together to talk about this. So I wanted to introduce some thoughts and ideas to you today and understand how you can go ahead and learn more at a later point. So first off, we're going to be talking about some common pitfalls along the journey. We're also going to talk about cloud design patterns, whether they actually exist or not, and how you can use them in your design. And then finally, understanding how you can take some of these insights that we'll share today and talk about and go and build upon them further. Things like the Azure Architecture Center, the Cloud Adoption Framework, and the Microsoft Azure Well-Architected Framework as well. So let's first off with quite a controversial statement. Why consider requirements? Well, there's a reason that I'm asking that question. Requirements is so important when we think about building any kind of design or any kind of solution. So let's take this away from a cloud scenario for a moment and think about a different scenario. Let's design a building. Where do you start? Now I'm deliberately pausing just to let your mind start racing here for a moment. And when you start thinking about that building, what type of building is it? How do you design the appropriate foundations for that building? What is the budget? These are all the types of questions that we might go ahead and ask ourselves. Maybe there's some external regulations that we need to go and adhere to. What are the time frames? Are there plans to expand at a later point? How many people does the building need to accommodate for? And we haven't really got into any specifics yet, but if you think about the scenario of a hospital is going to have some kind of design around the number of patients that it can hold, the number of departments that it might need to go and house, for example. It might be a specialist hospital, it might not be, it might be a generalist hospital. Compare that, for example, to a house or a block of apartments or an office building or a hotel. Each of those are going to have drastically different requirements depending upon the end target that you're really aiming for there. Now, if we think about all of those questions, like what type of building, what is the budget, what materials do we need to use, and do we need to adhere to external events like earthquakes? Because again, that could be a scenario depending upon where in the world we're building this building. All of these considerations could map to a cloud scenario. So think about that again. What is the type of cloud solution that we're building? What is the business purpose? Is it our main retail application where it's making all of our money? Or is it just a batch job that runs once a month and it does some back-end accounting that actually it doesn't matter when it runs or how often it runs, it's just something that is part of a business process and is not critical, for example? What is the budget? Can the budget stretch to fulfill all of the requirements that we need to meet? And again, cost is absolutely one of those angles of requirements we need to consider. How do you design the appropriate foundation? So setting up your landing zone, we'll come back to that in a bit. Do you need to adhere to external regulations? Are you in an industry like a financial services, a healthcare, or some other industry where maybe there's a lot of compliance around how you must approach your design? What are the timeframes? If you've got a mitigating or an external event that you need to go and adhere to, maybe that means that you have quite tight timeframes. So then do you need to go ahead and look at just rehosting what you currently have? You can't really spend the time to go and re-architect to a true cloud native scenario, for example. What does the future growth look like in terms of the business targets? And how does that map on to your capacity requirements, things like scalability, for example? And ultimately, those external events that you might need to go and adhere to there. So, for example, business continuity, high availability, and disaster recovery. How do you need to factor that into the solution? Is it acceptable to have downtime or not? So can you afford to, and can you afford not to? Coming back to that budget question. And overall, what materials do you need to use? Just like in the building scenario, you might have some specialist materials that you need to rely upon. Maybe you have the same in the cloud as well. So is there a limit on which Azure services, because of internal mandates from the company or external regulations? Or are there requirements that you still need to have management hands-on access, for example, to the underlying components? So PaaS is not an option. All of these factors will bubble up together into what will become your set of requirements. So absolutely lead with this first and consider those up front, because quite often I see people wanting to run very quickly into the technology, into the solution, without having those appropriate foundations and design principles in place. So that is thought number one. So how do you go ahead and actually map this out to something which is a little more standard in terms of pillars of software design or cloud architecture? There is a number of different frameworks out there, and one of those is the Microsoft Azure Well-Architected Framework. This is available in the Azure Architecture Center, and it's a set of recommendations and design principles for you to go ahead and improve the quality of your workload. So it focuses on a number of pillars: cost optimization, operational excellence, so that DevOps angle there, I suppose, performance efficiency, reliability, and security. So all of those non-functional requirements that are going to be very important to the end result of our solution, being able to have a set of recommended practices which wraps around those pillars. That is the Azure Well-Architected Framework. So if you haven't heard of that, I would certainly encourage you to go and take a look at the Azure Architecture Center docs and take a look at that information there. Now, of course, you need to figure out where to get started. And there is a great tool out there as well, the Azure Well-Architected Review. Now, those pillars that we just mentioned a bit earlier, cost optimization, operational excellence, performance efficiency, reliability, and security, they are all part of this well-architected assessment. And what you can do is you can go ahead, use this as a baseline to establish where you are on your journey. You can focus in on a particular pillar or all of the pillars, so then you can go ahead and build out a plan of what your requirements should look like over a longer term period. And there's no reason why you couldn't do that review again at a later point to understand the journey and the progress that you're making. So these are two great sets of tools to help you in those early stages as you begin designing your cloud solution. Now let's think about that for a moment. We're now at a stage where we've got those requirements and we need to map those to some kind of foundation. Now, think about this question. Are all foundations the same? How would the foundations look for a block of apartments compared to a house, or maybe a hospital compared to a hotel? Or if we think bigger scale, what about the foundations of a small village compared with a larger industrial town, for example? I'm hoping that you're already thinking with your building analogy once again from a bit earlier, because we're going to revisit that. So if you think about a house compared with an office compared with a hospital, for example, think about when you have the prefab of the building. Where do the sockets go for electricity? How do you make sure that all of the pipes reach the toilets and the sinks, for example? Is there specific building implementations that need to be had? So, for example, in a hotel, you would have individual guest rooms as opposed to an open plan area in a house, or maybe wards in a hospital, for example. How do you make sure that the building is being designed and developed in a way that complies with external regulations and standards? How do you go and make sure that it's meeting the specifications that you've gone ahead and designed for and giving you that appropriate foundation so that it is structurally solid? All of these are relevant questions because using a one-size-fits-all foundation is not going to work in a building scenario, right? You've got a house, you've got a hospital, you've got an office. The foundations of each of those are going to look very, very different, which will influence then the underpinnings of that design. And once again, you can really map that to a cloud scenario. So think about things like your identity, your resource organization, for example, your network topology and your connectivity. Maybe your governance and disciplines that you need to go ahead and adhere to, for example, external regulations. Being able to have a good operational baseline for your quality control, or being able to have a standard approach for your deployment options. All of these considerations map back to our foundation. And within an Azure perspective, that foundation we call the Cloud Adoption Framework. And the Cloud Adoption Framework is a collection of documentation. It's also implementation guidance and a series of best practices to help you go and accelerate that cloud journey. And it takes you through several stages, all the way from the strategy stage through to planning, through to the eventual migration, governance, management, and eventually being operational. Now, there are a few key parts of that, and one of those is this concept of a landing zone. To be honest, we could focus on the landing zone for the entire session that we have here today. So, as I say, this is very much just a high-level discussion around all of these topics and pointing you in the direction, because this landing zone concept is critical to making sure that you have a successful journey into the cloud. So, with that, let's move on and start thinking that we've now built our foundation. So we have our foundation in place now, but what happens? We want to go ahead and build an application on top of that. We want to go and build some kind of solution. The landing zone, the foundation, is the enabler for us to get to that application. So now that we've got those requirements and now that we've got that foundation in place, what is next? How do we start thinking about building that application? Well, first off, a good port of call is going to be the Azure Architecture Center. Now, the Azure Architecture Center has a set of guidance for architecting your solutions on Azure. Whether that is things like reference architectures, whether that is things like cloud design patterns, or the application architecture guide, for example. There is a wealth of information available on there for you. So rather than reinventing the wheel, why don't you go ahead, take a look at some of those existing patterns and existing architectures and see if there's something that you can use to help you along that journey quickly. And once again, we're going to be thinking in terms of requirements because applications are designed to fulfill some kind of business need. It's going to need to have some level of resilience. It's going to need to be within some level of cost. It's going to need to scale to a certain number of users or maybe a certain number of messages or items to be processed over a given period of time. So all of that, we can use the Azure Well-Architected Framework and the assessment to help us establish those baselines and how we go ahead and achieve those business goals. So again, do familiarize yourself with the Well-Architected Framework. Now, all of those pillars that we mentioned earlier about cost optimization, operational excellence, performance efficiency, reliability, and security, there are also a number of cloud design patterns which form around those pillars and a few other pillars as well. Quite commonly I get told or asked, is there such thing as a cloud design pattern? And the answer is absolutely yes. when we look at this screen right now, there's a number of different patterns, some of which you may recognize the names of, some of which may be brand new concepts. Things like the ambassador pattern, the back ends for front ends, gateway aggregation, things like the gateway routing pattern, the circuit breaker pattern, the external configuration store, command query responsibility segregation or CQRS, the strangler pattern, the static content hosting pattern. And a number of these patterns span across these different pillars. And when we think about building an effective system, things like the cache aside pattern or the orchestrator pattern, or again CQRS, the geode pattern, deployment stamps, there are many different patterns which are available out there for you to consume. But likewise, there are anti-patterns to be aware of as well. Having a busy database, retry storms, a busy front end, not using caching, for example. All of these things could be considered as anti-patterns when trying to build a solution in the cloud which is incredibly performant. But again, those pillars that we saw a little bit earlier from an architecture perspective, like operational excellence, you can see some of these patterns again are reoccurring across these different pillars. Even things like reliability are split into availability, high availability, and then resiliency as well. So depending upon the exact scenario and what we're trying to achieve there, will really determine which cloud design patterns are appropriate. Because we could decide to use every single one of these patterns, but have a super complex architecture which no one can understand. So this is where it always comes back to our requirements and understanding what we need to achieve the solution that we're trying to design here. So if we think about reliability, for example, and think about considerations and how we could go and map that out, another approach that we might use is something called a failure mode analysis. And what that involves us doing is 4 key stages: mapping the workload out, analyzing on a component by component basis. If a failure happens, what is the impact of that? And we're not just talking the Azure services themselves, but any third-party dependencies that you rely upon. For each of those components, define the risk, and then ultimately a plan to address if that happens. So that helps you identify what are those cascading failures, for example. And ultimately, this is called a failure mode analysis. And you could use this pattern, use this approach in a number of different scenarios, not just from a failure from a cloud service, but from an operational perspective, from a performance perspective. What happens if you have bottlenecks in certain parts of the system, for example? So again, all of these different pieces that we are going through here and looking through in terms of patterns and in terms of approaches are all well-documented patterns and well-documented approaches and principles in the Azure Architecture Center. Now, I hope that's been enlightening and given you some ideas in terms of areas that you could go and learn more. By no means in these 20 minutes will we going to go ahead and look through all of these different Azure architectural pieces of information and helping you understand them, but really wanting to just take you on the first steps of that journey, or maybe a few steps further on your journey, depending upon where you are already. So, where do you go to learn more? What are the next steps? Well, first off, Microsoft Learn. If you haven't used Microsoft Learn already, it's a set of modules, some of which form into learning paths, and there's also some interactive content like Learn TV, for example, which aligns to the Microsoft certifications. And if you're not there to skill up for the certifications, then some of this you may go ahead and want to apply in your own scenarios where you're building projects already. One of those modules is about building great solutions by using the Microsoft Azure Well-Architected Framework. So there's some great content in Learn, which is more about educating and upskilling than technical reference content. So go check out Microsoft Learn as a starter. Secondly, everything that we've talked about here in this session has really been influenced by the Azure Architecture Center. There's a great team behind the Azure Architecture Center and a community that is contributing lots of information into it. Reference architectures, cloud design patterns, anti-patterns, and more. The cloud adoption framework, the Azure well-architected framework, all of these concepts live inside of the Azure Architecture Center. So again, depending on where you are in your journey, there may be something relevant there for you. Whether you're at the very beginning or you're further ahead, you may be interested in reference architectures or you may be interested in cloud design patterns, but I'm sure there will be something there for you. And finally, my own site, cloudwithchris.com, as well. I have a series on there called Architecting for the Cloud, one pattern at a time. And what I do on there is I have a series of guests that come in and talk about these various cloud design patterns that we very quickly scanned through a bit earlier during this session. And we dive deep into those, understanding some of the challenges that they aim to solve, some of the challenges that they might introduce, or some of the considerations that we may have when implementing those patterns. And ultimately then, understanding how they can help us and where we may be able to combine some of those patterns together to help solve our architectural challenges. So if you are interested in some of that type of content, go ahead to cloudwithchris.com or search Cloud with Chris on YouTube and follow me on Twitter at RedO'Bowen for more of that type of content. And in those, we go a lot more in depth than what we've had the chance to go in this session today. But again, I hope this has been an insight into the first steps of a cloud architecture journey here for you today. So thank you for your attention during this presentation. Please go ahead, share your love with the team on social media using the hashtag CLLMarathon and at CloudLunchLearn.